Today we're going to explore the process of taking a piece of firewood and creating art. We're getting started on this piece with the rough turning. So at this point we've taken the log, kind of sliced it in half, and we've got a circular shape that we've already cut out at the bandsaw just to try to get some of the rough edges off. In this first stage, really what we're shooting for is to get the bowl blank round, and then we'll start forming the bottom. So rough turning on this bowl is going to be a little bit easier than some others that we've done. This blank, I can tell by the weight that the log is spalted. It's starting to decay, so it's much lighter, and you're seeing big chunks coming off right away as we're turning. We've got a relatively slow speed, so we just want to get it round, try to get the blank balance so we can turn up the speed and get some better cuts. The other challenge that you never know with wood that's already spalted is how far gone it is. So if it's got too much spalting, which is just rot and decay, too much of the spalting, the wood, the blank, it just disintegrates and it really won't form, it really won't shape. So we're always fighting time here a little bit when we're working with spalted wood. It's sort of that combination of the spalting's great because it gives you a unique patterns and textures in the finished piece. But the flip side of it is if it's too far gone, you just really can't do anything with it. And here at this rough stage, this is where we're kind of shaping out and trying to figure out if this is even going to work or not. So let's jump ahead here a little bit. As I was rough turning, I did flatten off the bottom side of the bowl, and here I'm just marking for a tenon, which we'll end up using to reverse mount this bowl blank in our 4-jaw chuck. With marks in place on the bottom of the bowl, now I just want to continue flattening the bottom of the bowl and also creating that tenon. So I like to use a tenon for the 4-jaw chuck just to kind of grip onto, and I try to make that tenon as wide as I possibly can, really on any bowl. So in this case I'm going to use jumbo jaws, which are about 4.5 inches or so, give or take a little bit wide, or that's what they'll open to. And I like to have that extra material because in the very last stage we're going to take that tenon, we're going to turn it away, but as we do turn away that tenon, we're going to use that material to form the foot of the bowl. So I like to have as much material to work with, so I make that tenon here at this stage about as wide as I can on each piece. As we're putting the final touches on the tenon, I'm also going to create a flat shoulder just beyond the width of the tenon, and that's where the chuck jaws are going to basically mate up against that flat surface so that when we reverse the bowl around, it'll run pretty straight and true. Now I'm narrating this bit out of order just a little bit, but currently I've got this bowl mounted to the lathe using a faceplate. With a spalted blank like this, I like to use a faceplate. In fact, I use a faceplate for most projects when I'm starting out, but especially with a spalted bowl where I know the integrity of the wood is a little bit suspect. I talked about it a little bit earlier, and so having multiple screws, and I'll put 6 or 8 screws into the faceplate on a piece like this, just because I'm trying to keep it from flying off the lathe. At this point, let's also touch on safety just for a second. So I know I've got some rot and decay in this bowl blank, so I want to make sure I protect my lungs. In this shot, you can kind of tell as I'm turning this, I've got my full face respirator on. I really prefer turning really anytime, not just sanding, but most of the time I use that respirator, but it's very important in this case to just help protect our lungs. So let's skip ahead just a little bit here as we go. We're kind of working, trying to get the exterior shape of the bowl just kind of refined here a little bit. And as we do that, really what we're trying to do is get a nice sweeping, smooth, arcing curve from the bottom, from that tenon, which is going to form our foot later, all the way out to the edge of the bowl. Now we know we've got a unique shape of this bowl. It's going to be a deep bowl with a closed rim. So really what we're really worried about here at this point is just the very bottom of the bowl. So we're really going to try to refine this shape here on the very bottom. And then one of the last steps that we're going to take before we reverse mount the bowl is we're also going to break out the negative rake scraper. With that tool, we're just going to start trying to refine, get the tool marks, get that bottom as smooth as we can, and hopefully it'll help us save some of our sanding effort at the end. Now we've got the bowl reversed around, and it's time to start working on the inside. The first step here is I just want to get this face kind of flat and smooth. That'll help balance the blank on the lathe. That'll help us turn up the speed a little bit so we can get more efficient, cleaner cuts. And then we'll start working on the final shape for this bowl. We're going to end up with a closed rim bowl, so we're going to kind of do some roughing here on this face before we start working on that final shape. With the inside face of the bowl flat, now we want to start working back on the outside and creating our final shape for the bowl. So we're back working on the exterior, just kind of rounding over that outside edge. And we're going to swing around here. And we're using kind of a combination of bevel supported push cuts with our bowl gouge to kind of create that rounded outside curved shape. And then we're also going to refine that form with shear scrapes using the bowl gouge as well. The footage I had of the next step, which was drilling a depth hole, really was pretty well useless, but I did create a depth hole, and now we're back to hogging out the interior of the bowl. I am using the tailstock here, which I will often do on larger bowls like this, especially ones that are spalted. So we do have a pretty good firm grip on a nice wide tenon on the bottom of the bowl, but sometimes these spalted bowls are a lot more fragile. And so here I'm just using the tailstock as extra support just to try to make sure I don't, get a catch or something and throw this bowl blank off the lathe. So let's jump ahead here a little bit. We've moved the tailstock out of the way, and we're currently using a large bowl scraper just to kind of keep coring down to the bottom of the bowl. You can kind of see there in the middle where the depth hole has been drilled. So we're just going to keep working our way down to the bottom of the bowl, and then we'll also need to work on creating that inside shape with that closed rim. On projects like this, I use my 5/8 inch bowl gouge for the vast majority of things, but I have a swept back grind on that, and while it will do most things very well, getting down to the bottom of a bowl has its limitations. So that's when I switch over to this tool, this large bowl scraper. And that allows me to effectively and efficiently just kind of finish up on the bottom of a bowl or vessel where my bowl gouge struggles to work well. As we move along here, it's time to start shaping and forming the closed rim feature. So here I've switched to a hollowing tool. This is a Robert Sorby hollower that works with the Sovereign system. And the tip of the tool has an articulating head. So it can very easily, it kind of curves and can go right up underneath that closed rim. Oftentimes I'll use this tool with vases and other deeper hollow vessels. In this case, we don't really need the reach or the depth, but getting back underneath that rim is pretty effective. So this tool right here is helping us make pretty quick, efficient work of undercutting that sidewall. I like to keep these videos brief, but yet still informative. So if there are details like this hollowing tool, for example, that you're interested in or you'd like to see more detail on, please drop me a comment in the comment sections. I always read and respond to all the comments. I'm happy to answer questions there, or if it makes sense to take a closer look at your questions in another video to answer more questions in more detail. And of course, subscribing to the channel will help you keep up with us so you'll know when we're answering those questions in other videos. With the sidewall finished up with the hollowing tool, we've switched back to the bowl scraper, and here we're just going to get down to the final depth in the bowl. The one thing that's a little bit different here, you'll notice, or you might have noticed in the shot, is I've changed tool rests. I rarely switch from my kind of standard tool rest that came with the lathe, but here I'm using a tool rest designed for the inside of a bowl, and on this shape it's just going to help me make sure I don't have too much of that scraper extended out over the tool rest. Here we're starting to work on refining the final shape and smoothing out all the different surfaces on the bowl. And I've switched to another tool in the Sorby Sovereign system. This is just a kind of a typical cutter tool. In this case, I'm using a high-speed steel cutter instead of a carbide cutter, but I'm using this tool here just to help refine the shape on the outside and inside of the bowl and get down to our final depth. We're finally down to our final depth, and here we're just using a negative rake scraper just to clean up the bottom of the bowl, remove any tear out, and just start the finishing process and getting a final surface on the bottom of the bowl. With the inside of the bowl smoothed out, it's time to work back on the outside. So we've got the negative rake scraper, and we're using that tool rest, that bowl tool rest, to kind of, which in this case almost perfectly mimics the outside shape of our bowl. So we're using the negative rake scraper just to kind of smooth off the outside, get rid of any tool marks, and hopefully this will save us a little effort when we start sanding. Now it's time for everyone's favorite part of the project, which is sanding. I like to use an air-powered die grinder to power sand at least quite a bit of the bowl. I find this is just a pretty fast, efficient way to get through the grits, and I work on a bowl like this. I'm going to go through the grits from 80 grit all the way up to 320. The other thing you'll notice here is while I was turning most of this project, I was using my respirator, but especially in sanding, you want to protect your lungs and use a respirator of some sort. Even though I've got the lathe running in reverse, I've got a box over here on the wall mounted or connected to my vacuum, and I'm trying to capture and gather as much dust as possible. I still want to make sure I'm protecting my lungs while I'm working on this project. The last step in the turning process is to reverse mount the bowl again. Here I'm using coal jaws, and since we've got a closed rim form, I'm actually using the coal jaws in kind of expansion mode. So I'm putting pressure from the inside out on the inside rim of the bowl, and that's holding the bowl up against that aluminum plate. I'm also using the tailstock for additional support, because the last thing I want to do at this point is send this bowl skipping across the shop. So here I'm just using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge to work down the tenon, and we're going to use that tenon to create a foot for the bowl to sit on. Now keep in mind, in one of our earlier steps as we were forming the tenon, I mentioned that I wanted to keep the tenon, or I wanted to make the tenon as wide as possible. And that's why here, this is the step why I want that tenon to be wide, is because now it gives me a nice good surface for that bowl to sit on in its final form. And before we take the bowl off the lathe entirely, once we've got the foot formed, we're going to use our power sander to run back through the grits on the foot and bottom of the bowl. With the sanding wrapped up, now it's time to start applying finish. You can see here in this shot I'm working on several pieces all at one time, and in this step I'm just applying a 3-pound cut of shellac. I like to use the shellac because it pulls out some of the natural colorations in the wood. It makes it look much like a oil-based kind of a hand-rubbed finish, and yet it still dries very quickly. So I apply a light coat of this shellac on the inside and outside of the bowl, and then in the next step we're going to spray General Finishes High Performance. This combination of using the shellac, which dries relatively quickly, and then the High Performance using it with a spray allows me to build 5 to 8 coats in the matter of hours instead of days.